All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I will just give me a moment to share my screen and we can get started. Let's dive in. How's everyone doing today? Hope you're doing well. My name is Ross Reinhardt. I'm the Director of Content at LSAT Max. I've been teaching the LSAT in some capacity for over 8 years now. Been doing it a long time, been doing some other stuff with creating content, doing some marketing, doing some course development and training and managing of instructors, kind of done a little bit of everything in the LSAT space. And now I get to kind of help out managing our amazing team of instructors at LSAT Max and doing some behind the scenes content stuff. And another thing I get to do, one of my favorite things I get to do at LSAT Max is do these webinars, actually get some FaceTime with some students, some people who are looking to start their LSAT journey. And it really is one of the most rewarding opportunities I get at LSAT Max, getting out in front of the students, in front of the people and talking the LSAT. That's one of my favorite things to do. And I want to thank you all for joining me on this today. What we're talking about today is reading comprehension. I've been doing these webinars with LSAT Max for almost 6 months now, and we haven't done one, at least I haven't done one on reading comprehension yet. And reading comprehension does tend to be the kind of neglected, redheaded stepchild of logic of the LSAT. People tend to focus a bit more on logic games and a bit more on logical reasoning, even though now reading comprehension as a section has the biggest impact on your score. So I wanted to rectify the fact that a lot of people overlook reading comprehension and that we haven't done a reading comp webinar yet and talk about some of the misconceptions affecting reading comprehension. And that's going to be why we have the title of today's webinar, Don't Believe Everything You Read About Reading Comp. We're going to talk about some of those misconceptions about reading comprehension and how we can correct those misconceptions so they don't impair our own study process. Now, before we do, want to have a little warm up. Now, we're all going to have a better time at this webinar and get more out of it if we are using that chat section of Zoom. So what I'd like you all to do as a little icebreaker is to open up that chat section and change the recipient line on the chat section to all panelists or to hosts and panelists. So it looks like they've changed it since the last Zoom update. So change it to host and panelists. That way we can see everybody's responses. And in that section, go ahead and write out where you're from, where you went to college and what you studied, or if you're in college, where you're at and what you're studying. And finally, since reading comprehension is the topic of today, what is your favorite book? Or if you're not so much of a book person, if it's been a minute since the last book you've read, something else that you like to read, whether that's like recipes or Reddit or YouTube comments. I don't know, that'd be a little strange, but just let me know what you'd like to read. All right, we got a couple people chiming in already. Good to see we're following directions about the host and panelists. So Susan from New Jersey, shouts to you, Susan, first on the board. Nice beat. Steve from Dayton, Ohio. Yumin from South Korea. Very cool. And Deepal from Canada. We are international in this webinar. That's awesome. Susan's studying history. Ryan's in Columbia. Yumin's in Temple University doing some media production. Oh, we got the Netherlands too. Studied law at Amsterdam. Very cool. Very cool from Tim Bond. Let's see. We got Arizona, UCLA. Shouts to the Bruins. Former Bruins myself. What's up, Camille? Leah from Charlottesville, went to UVA, loves The Great Gatsby, classic, backs born to the whatever screen or whatever the last line is. Let's see, we got, wow, so many things. Everyone, oh, you know what? Go ahead and make sure your panel says to everyone. My mistake on that. Host and panelist is only going to be seen by me and some of my colleagues. So everyone will be able to see each other's statements if we change it to everyone. So my mistake there. Thanks for catching it. Okay, so many people from so many different places. Good to see that we have an international presence. We got both sides. of the US and a bunch of places in between. All right. Let's get started. Let's talk about reading comprehension. Let's set the agenda for today. What are we going to be doing today? So in terms of what we're going to be covering, first, we're just going to cover reading comprehension basics, reading comp basics. So if you're brand new to studying to the LSAT, if you haven't even taken your first practice test yet, we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to be talking about some basics of reading comp. Like, for instance, it is short for reading comprehension. First basic right there. We'll also be talking about what the cut section of reading comp consists of, what are some of the topics of the passages, what are some of the questions we see, and then we're going to get a little bit more philosophical with our discussion of reading comprehension. We're going to talk about what reading comprehension tests and why does it test this? Why is it important to the LSAT that they have this section? Really, why is it important to law schools that they have this section? That's going to give us a good kind of basic understanding of reading comprehension. And then that's going to lead us to what's going to be the heart of today's presentation, which are 5 misconceptions about reading comprehension. I've been teaching the LSAT for a long time, been interfacing with thousands of students at this point. And I hear from both students and also some people who, get paid to teach the LSAT, a lot of bad advice about the reading comprehension section in particular. A lot of misleading statements about reading comprehension, a lot of bad approaches that get advocated in reading comprehension. And I want to clear those up. So I want to talk about 5 big misconceptions that I've heard over and over again about reading comprehension. And we're not just going to talk about those misconceptions and be like, all right, deal with it. Don't have those misconceptions. We're actually talk about how we can sidestep those misconceptions and make sure that they don't impair our own study process with this admittedly very difficult section of the test. So that's going to be the main topic for today's webinar, the 5 misconceptions. We'll even be kind of doing some exercises together through this chat section to help us kind of get a better picture of reading comprehension. At the end of this, I'll give you a spiel about LSAT Max, talk about the course that you can take to get better at reading comprehension, or the tutors you can work with to get better at reading comprehension. And then for the last 20 to 30 minutes, we'll have an open Q&A. So any questions you have about the LSAT or law school admissions process, doesn't have to be related to reading comprehension, can really be about anything, I want to address. Now, when you do have questions, make sure to go ahead and put it in the Q&A section of Zoom, not the chat section you're all currently using, but instead the Q&A section. You put a question in the chat section that you want answered at the end of this, it's going to be really hard for me to find it. It's just a lot easier if you put it in the Q&A section. It's easier to find. I'll be able to answer it so you can have your question answered. If you do have a question about anything I'm talking about in the moment, as it pertains to what's on the screen, you can put it in the chat section. That'll be the easiest way for me to see it. But for the questions you want answered at the end, especially if those questions don't relate to what we're talking about live, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section, and I will address those at the end. I see you got a question right now. Ryan asked how much time we should allocate for this meeting. I'm going to try to get it done in 90 minutes. Might go a little bit over with that Q&A section, but we're going to aim for 90 minutes with the Q&A section. But we got a lot to go over today, 5 big misconceptions, and I want to make sure they all get their due. All right, so guys, ready to get started? Let's dive in with some reading comp basics. So reading comprehension, let's talk about the section writ large. So for reading comprehension, you will get 4 passages. Now, each passage is going to be about 450 words long. That's not long. If any of you were writing with a word count for any of your college courses, you know that 450 words is not a lot of words. These passages aren't long. That's not what makes them difficult. These passages are typically difficult because they're dense. They pack a lot in to those 450 or so words. Now, in terms of topics that you'll see on reading comprehension, you pretty much always get a topic about science, which might be a little bit frightening to some of us. A lot of us don't come from a science background. But when we get a science topic on reading comprehension, usually they talk about biology or plant biology, something like that. Sometimes they talk about like ecology or some environmental science. Sometimes they talk about neurology, like how our brains work. Sometimes they get like really, really spacey, really kind of trippy with some crazy astronomy passages. Sometimes they talk about geology. Plate tectonics is a popular topic. Sometimes they talk about physiology, how our bodies work. So we see they kind of run a wide gamut of science passages, but you'll pretty much always get at least one science passage on your reading comp section. You also pretty much always get one law passage. Now, these passages aren't like what you'll be reading in law school. They're not talking about like how proximate cause is a factor in tort law, or whether there needs to be a binding agreement and how that agreement can be expressed in a contract. It's not that kind of stuff that you'll be reading in law school. It tends to be a little bit more like, hey, here's something about courts that you maybe haven't heard about. Or here's an issue of legal ethics that sometimes appears. Or here's this one case that we want to talk about. Or let's talk about international law, treaties, that kind of stuff. So it's not law school-y stuff, but it does deal with the law. You also pretty much always get one passage about humanities. Usually the passage will be about like visual art. We see stuff about paintings or sculpture, architecture. Sometimes it's about literature. Sometimes we get philosophy passages. Even sometimes we get passages about music. Beyond that, sometimes you get a repeat of a science, law, or humanities passage, but sometimes they throw like a social science passage in there too. Usually something about economics or historiography, which is the writing or conceptualization of history, sociology or anthropology, that kind of stuff. Now, one thing that the test writers definitely don't want to do when they're selecting a topic for the reading comprehension passage is advantage any test takers who have prior knowledge about those topics. And for that reason, the topics tend to be either pretty obscure or pretty outdated. Like obscure, like it's about some very small facet of science that you're unlikely to have encountered in like a high school biology class, or it's about some very obscure, not terribly well-known artist, or it's really outdated. Like there was a passage from a couple of years ago that was describing the debate between in the scientific community about whether the planet's actually warming. Like you kind of read that passage and you're like, well, was this written in like the 70s? So they don't want to kind of benefit or advantage unfairly test takers who do have background knowledge in the sciences or in the law or in the humanities or in a specific element of social science. And for that reason, political science as a topic is glaringly absent from reading comprehension. And I think we can all kind of figure out why that's the case. Now, I should also talk about in reading comprehension, one of those four passages is going to be called a comparative or dual passage. In LSAT Max, we called it the comparative passage. And those passages consist of two shorter and related passages. And the questions that you tend to get on these comparative passages are about the relationship between those two passages. What do the authors of those two passages agree on? What do they disagree on? What's the central topic of both passages? What's something that's in one passage and not the other? That kind of thing. And that comparative passage has been present on the LSAT since 2007. So if you're doing any of the passages from prep test in the 2007s or later, you'll see one of those comparative passages. If you're doing any prep tests from the prep test from 2006 or before, you will not see that comparative passage. I should also mention that on the current iteration of the LSAT, which is an online test that you take at home, you are given a couple tools to interact with the passage. You have a highlighter. In fact, you have three highlighters, three different colors, a pink, yellow, and orange highlighter. You also have an underlining feature, so you can underline stuff in the passage. You can erase what you've highlighted or underlined. You can also make the text smaller or bigger or change the line spacing. And then you also have scratch paper that you can use to jot down some notes. Now, beyond that, you of course get some questions on reading comprehension. In fact, you get 27 questions usually for reading comprehension. Those questions, each passage can have somewhere between 5 and 8 questions, and you pretty much always get a total of 27 questions. Now, I'm going to quickly go over the types of questions because that's going to really frame what we talk about We talk about how we can best approach reading comprehension. I've kind of broken down the questions into 6 general categories of questions. The first category of questions that we see on reading comprehension are what I like to think of as major point questions. These are questions about the big, overarching features of the passage. And these account for about 1/6 of all of the questions that you get on reading comp. The most common of these questions is called a main point question. These ask you for quite literally the main point of the passage, or the main idea of the passage, or the main conclusion of the passage. They're asking you like, hey, what was the point of this? Why? What was the author trying to express to you in this passage? Usually that's the first question you get on a given passage, and nearly all of the long, non-comparative passages have a main point question. So you should expect to get about 3 of these on your tests. You also get sometimes a primary purpose question. And these ask about the primary purpose of the passage. Why was the passage written? How was the passage written to accomplish that goal? Now, a really common question is like, what's the difference between the main point and primary purpose? They're kind of similar. Well, the main point tends to be the what of the passage. What was this passage about? What was this author trying to convey to you? On the other hand, the primary purpose is the why. Why was this passage written? And sometimes included in that is, how was this passage written? And the way this kind of affects the answer choices you see on these 2 questions is the main point is going to get very specific about what the passage was saying. So if the passage was about, how homing pigeons find their way home. Like, how do pigeons, set off miles and miles away from the coop in which they live? How are they able to find their way home? And the passage says, hey, there's 2 theories about how they find their way home, and both theories kind of have some problems, and we don't really know how they do it. Well, the main point would be there are 2 theories of how homing pigeons find their way home, although it has not been conclusively shown how they do so. The primary purpose is almost going to vacuum out all of that subject matter and get into just a very structural idea of why that passage was written. So for that same passage, the answer to the primary purpose question might be something like to describe 2 explanations of a mysterious trait in an animal. So it's not talking about what that animal is or what that mysterious trait is, homing pigeons and their ability to find their way home. It's not talking about the 2 different ways or the different theories we have for how they do so. It's just saying, hey, it's to outline 2 theories to a mysterious trait in an animal. So that's kind of what we see. And if you're doing reading comprehension well, you're gonna be able to see both of those things pretty clearly after reading the passage. We'll talk about some tricks of how to do that. Another question you get on these is title questions. Title questions are rare. Wouldn't expect to see any on your test. But when you do get a title question, you can essentially think of it as a main point question, a question that is asking about the main point, because the title you select should reflect the main point of that passage. So the major point questions, that's going to contrast with the next type of question we see on reading comprehension, which is a minor point question. And minor point questions amount to roughly under 1/3 of all questions on reading comprehension. So these are about the details, or at least they purport to be about the details of the passage. They're going to talk about, according to the passage, what is true. What does the passage say is true? What can be inferred from the passage? What does the passage most strongly suggest? We think of those 2 types of questions as detail questions. Those are asking for a detail explicitly referenced in the passage. You should expect about 4 of those. And we can think of those as inference questions. These are asking us for what's implied by the passage. What might not be explicitly mentioned, but what would have to be true if everything that we learned in the passage was true. And for those inference questions, we should expect about 3 of those. We'll also sometimes see a question that deals with the meaning of a phrase used in the passage. What did the author mean when they said this? The next type of question is a very, very abstract question type. We think of these as argument structure questions. Now, these aren't going to really be about the details in the passage at all. They're not even really about the subject matter of the passage. These questions instead ask us for how the argument was developed in the passage. And these account for about 1/7 of all of the reading comp questions. Some of these questions ask for the role or function of a detail in the passage, or the role or function of a paragraph in that passage. We should expect about 3 of those on our test. These questions really get us to think about, hey, why did the author mention this? What was the purpose of this? What function does it play in developing the argument and main point of this passage? We'll also get some organization questions. These really ask us for the overall organization of the passage, really the role or function of all of the paragraphs in the passage. And we also sometimes get questions about the principle that underlines the argument in the passage. Those are pretty rare, and we don't really expect you to see any. Now, we'll also see some tone questions. In fact, about 1/4 of all questions on the LSAT reading comprehension section are tone questions. Now, the most common of these, and the most common question type in reading comprehension in general, asks you about the author of the passage's tone or attitude or viewpoint. These amount to about 1/5 of all the questions. You should expect about 6 of these on your test. They can ask you, what would the author be most likely to agree with, like asking about the author's views. They might ask you about the author's attitude towards a subject in the passage. They might even give you questions that relate to the tone that the author uses. Like, given the author's tone, who do we expect this passage to be written for? Like, is it written for a very general audience? Is it written for more of an academic audience? Is it written for like a specialist, kind of hobbyist audience? What do we think given the author's tone? So given the sheer number of author's tone, attitude, and viewpoint questions, we should imagine that identifying the author's tone, understanding the author's tone is a very important part of doing reading comp. We'll also get some questions about other people's tones, attitudes, or viewpoints. Sometimes the author isn't describing their own view. Sometimes the author is describing someone else's view. And occasionally we'll get questions about that other person's tone, attitude, or viewpoint as well. The next type of question, which account for about 1/9 of all questions on reading comp, are application questions. These questions either ask you to take something in the passage and apply it to a different situation. That's what these parallel and hypothetical questions do. Or they ask you to take an answer choice from a question and apply it to the passage to see if it strengthens or weakens something in the passage. And finally, pretty rare, but these can account for a category of their own, we get extension questions. These questions actually ask you to kind of finish writing the passage for the author. They ask you to most logically complete the passage. Now, in all honesty, we can kind of just include these questions with the major point questions because these questions are essentially main point questions. The way that we would have to finish the passage for the author would have to be consonant with the author's main point. But those are all the questions that we get on reading comprehension. Now I want to talk a little bit philosophically, epistemologically about what reading comprehension tests and why. So what does reading comprehension test? Now, I want to provide a really succinct and hopefully memorable description of what reading comprehension tests. And to do so, I actually had to borrow the phrasing of one of my students because I kind of just loved that phrasing the student used. Reading comprehension tests your ability to quickly decoct the gist out of a short passage. So to decoct means like to reduce, to extract the essence of, and the gist in this case just refers to the main point of the author's argument and how that argument is structured. That is essentially what reading comprehension tests. Now, what does reading comprehension not really test? Well, the first thing it doesn't test is your ability to become an expert in the topic that the passage describes. In fact, we don't even really need to become experts in the passage in the first place. One major impediment a lot of test takers have when trying to approach reading comprehension is they want to memorize or have notes for every last little detail in the passage. And then when they go and do the questions, they want to go back to the passage and find that detail again to confirm that every answer choice is either correct or incorrect. But the truth is that most questions do not require you to find details mentioned in the passage. Now, I know if you've been paying attention, you might think, well, you just said like 5 minutes ago that about a third of the questions involve minor points, details in the question, in the passage. So now you're saying that most questions do not require you to find those details? And that's going to be true, strangely enough. Even when questions purport to be about details, a lot of times we can answer them just by having a really strong understanding of the main point and the author's opinion. Some questions will require us to look back to the passage, but those are rare. Maybe one or two of those questions will appear in a given passage. Most questions can be answered with a really strong understanding of the main point, structure, and author's attitude in that passage. Now, why does reading comprehension care more about your ability to decoct the gist out of a short passage, to really just be fluent in the main point and how that argument was structured, and not necessarily in all the details, on the picayune details? Well, if we think about law school, in law school, you'll be expected to read many, many judicial opinions about stuff you've never even heard about before. And these opinions will be across a wide variety of legal cases and for a very wide diversity of law areas. And you will be expected to decoct the gist out of these opinions. In class and on tests, you're not going to have time to research the details in the passage. After reading these cases, when your professor calls on you to ask you questions about the case, like, hey, what was the finding in this case? What was the reasoning the juror employed to get to that finding? Or when it comes time to apply that case to a fact pattern on a final exam, you're not going to have time to research all the details in these cases. You'll be expected to, in short order, provide a cogent and accurate description of the decision in that opinion and how the reasoning led the juror to that decision. In other words, you'll be expected to provide the main point of that juror's argument and how that argument was structured. And you're not going to have time to go back to these cases and reread them to answer these questions in class or on a test. I know I tried to do that in my very first law school class. And my professor said in front of everyone, no, don't look at the case, look at me, answer me. Now, fortunately, I was too obtuse to know I was supposed to be embarrassed by that. But after the class, everyone came up to me. I was like, wow, are you all right? That was pretty harsh. And I was like, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to be embarrassed, but thank you, I guess. Although I feel a little embarrassed now. But it's the truth. You are expected in law school to be able to get to the heart of the cases you read. And that's why reading comprehension is more concerned with your ability to get to the heart of the passages that they present to you. And I wanted to make this last point just to address a common belief about reading comprehension and the LSAT more generally. This common belief that I hear from a lot of people is that the LSAT really doesn't have any relationship to what you do in law school. Now, you can take as much or as little of what you learn in the LSAT to law school as you'd like. But when people say that the LSAT has very little relationship to law school, that tends to be a sign that they had major misconceptions about what the LSAT was actually testing. And I don't want any of you to have major misconceptions about what the LSAT is actually testing, especially with reading comp, which, as we talked about, tends to have a lot of bad advice and bad information out there. So that's going to segue nicely into 5 misconceptions about reading comprehension. I want to go over 5 misconceptions about reading comprehension and what we can do to avoid those misconceptions as we study reading comprehension. Now, before we do it, does anyone have any questions about the basics of reading comp they want to have clarified before we move over? Because now we're going to be talking about reading comprehension in quite a bit more specificity. So give you all a moment to ask any questions that you might have. If you're ready to move on, you can hit OK. And we can move on to these 5 misconceptions. Aaron, reading comprehension is scored like any other section of the LSAT. You get 1 point for every question that you answer correctly. Those points that you accrue then get converted into your scaled score, which is a number between 120 and 180. So reading comprehension is scored like every other section of the LSAT. 1 point in your raw score for every question you answer correctly. Then all of the points that you earn in your raw score get converted to your scaled score between 120 and 180. There's no guessing penalties. So if you don't get to a question, if you don't know the answer to the question, just guess on it. Cool. Looks like we're ready to move on. So let's get to the 5 misconceptions. And I got to apologize for this this art I made on these slides. I have a real weakness for stock photos. I just think they're hilarious. And there's a lot of stock photos of confused dudes. So all of these misconceptions will have photos of very confused guys, presumably because they are confused about reading comprehension. But let's talk about the first misconception, which is that I have to memorize or look up a ton of details in the passage to do well on reading comprehension. Now, there is a ton of good reasons why people have this misconception. We just talked about how about a third of the questions seem to be about minor details in the passage. So a lot of people come away from that and they say, you know what, it looks like details are super important in reading comprehension. I got to find a way to memorize these details or look them up as I'm answering the questions. But that's not quite true. Even though roughly a third of the questions are minor point questions, test takers who look back on the passage for many questions in reading comprehension tend to struggle the most with reading comp. Instead, the test takers who do the best on reading comprehension actually have a really strong understanding of the main point and the author's opinion. That's far more important to understand than the details of the passage. Now, there's a few reasons for that. Understanding the main point and the author's opinion will help you on far more questions than focusing on details. About 43% of the questions relate to the main point and author's attitude, as opposed to roughly 31% of the questions that purport to be about the details. But beyond that, understanding the main point and author's opinion will help you on a whole host of other questions too, even some minor point questions. That's because even many questions that look like minor point questions are actually asking about the main point and the author's opinion. Some questions look like small detail questions, but are actually big picture questions. And I say that to say that many of the answer choices are wrong on these seemingly minor point questions because that answer choice conflicts with the main point or the author's opinion as expressed in that passage. So you don't need to look up details in the passage to eliminate many answer choices on these minor point questions. You can just say, oh, this can't be right. It's different than the main point. It's inconsistent with the main point. It's inconsistent with the author's opinion. In fact, many times the right answer to minor point questions is simply a part of the main point or the entire main point itself. And additionally, starting with main point and author's opinion, taking that away first from the passage before you attempt to become an expert in the details, can help you better understand which details in that passage are important. And by that, I mean they're relevant to answering those questions, and which details are unimportant and unworthy of your time or cognitive bandwidth. So it's important that during reading comprehension, we don't have what I'll refer to as a detail-centric approach when we read or answer questions, because that detail-centric approach can have a ton of downsides. One, it can lead you to missing the main point. If you're too focused on learning, memorizing, taking notes on all the little details in the passage, you can miss the main point. You might know what those details are, but you don't know why those details are there, how the author feels about those details, and how those details do or do not support the main conclusion or main point of that passage. One phrase that I have to use all the time when I'm teaching reading comprehension is, I think you may be missing the forest through the trees. People learn so much about the little details that they forget about the reason those details are there, which is to illustrate the main point. Having a detail-centric approach while you answer questions can also result in spending too much time researching as you're answering those questions. A lot of people have difficulty finishing the reading comprehension section on time. And a major reason that is they just spend too much time looking back at the passage. As we talked about, you don't need to look back at the passage to answer most questions. So as you're doing reading comprehension, whether you're going to start doing reading comprehension once you start studying, or if you're in the midst of your study process right now, think about whether you're over-researching the passage. The most effective test takers on reading comprehension tend to only look back at the passage once or twice as they're answering questions in a given passage. They definitely don't look back at the passage on every question, or even more so, on every answer choice for every question. You spend too much time researching, a lot of times that's just going to waste a lot of time on reading comprehension and prevent you from finishing the section or feeling comfortable with the amount of time that you have to finish the section. Finally, and in a lot of ways, most importantly, researching too often in the questions can be ineffective. That's because for most questions, there isn't a single line in the passage that will prove definitively that an answer choice is correct. Most questions, even many detail questions, require you to synthesize different parts of the passage to get it correct. Like the question might be about a belief that scientists have, and one part of the passage might say, hey, this was a common belief that scientists had a while ago. And then another part of the passage, a few paragraphs later, might say, hey, but new researchers have overturned that common belief. Where you kind of need both parts of the passage to infer what the belief of scientists is now after that new study corrected that belief. So if you're looking for some smoking gun phrase that's going to prove that an answer choice is correct, you're probably not going to find it, because for most questions, that phrase simply doesn't exist. And that gets to one of the most harmful misconceptions about reading comprehension. The misconception is that there's a single spot in every passage that will show why every correct answer choice is correct. That's simply not the case. Far more often, it's the passage as a whole or multiple paragraphs of that passage that will show why a correct answer is correct. So instead of trying to focus on the details in a very myopic manner, we instead want to abstract our understanding of the passage and know about the main point, which raises the question, like, if the main point is so important, how do we find it reliably in a passage? And I know this is an issue that many students struggle with. A lot of times I hear phrases like, hey, I'm pretty good at reading comprehension, or I think I'm doing well in reading comprehension, except for the main point. I get that question wrong all the time. That's a little bit amusing to me, because saying that you feel okay about reading comprehension, but not the main point, is sort of like saying you feel pretty good about swimming, except for the staying afloat part. The main point is just so central to answering these questions that it really can be, in a lot of ways, the purpose of doing these passages. The main goal you want to take out of the passage is figuring out that main point. From that, you can figure out all of those details and understand the purpose of those details and be better at finding those details. So how can we find that main point reliably? That is the most important part of reading comprehension. Well, one thing we can look for is conclusion indicator words in the passage. Words like thus, therefore, hence, so, clearly, it follows. When we see these words, that's a word that an author is going to use to really say, hey, I'm going to offer my conclusion now. I'm going to tell you the main conclusion and thus the main point of this passage. So these can be a common way, or these can be a way to find the main point. But in reading comprehension, where they want to kind of hide the main point a little bit, we tend to not see these words quite as often as we would like. Words that we do see a fair amount, though, are what I'll refer to as shift words. These are words where the author shifts from describing someone else's view or shifts from a neutral perspective into a very opinionated perspective. The words that the author will use when they want to shift into giving you their opinion. A lot of times these words get used when the author wants to give you the most important piece of their opinion, the main point of that passage. So these are words like but, however, although, nonetheless. These words get used frequently to express the main point of a passage. So we really want to be reading these passages carefully. And when we hear these words or read these words in the passage, our ears should kind of perk up and we should realize, like, oh, this word but is important. This word however is important because what follows from this word might be the main point of this passage. Now, these first two methods are helpful when there's a sentence or a couple of sentences in the passage that serve as that passage's overall main point. That's not always the case, though. Some passages don't give you the main point on a silver platter, so we'll need some backup plans for other ways to find the main point. So a couple techniques you can use to find the main point when there isn't a sentence in the passage that kind of serves as that main point. One is just think about what are the viewpoints that are expressed in the passage. Was there one viewpoint being expressed in the passage? Were there a couple of viewpoints being expressed in the passage? Were there 3 viewpoints being expressed in that passage? Think about the viewpoints expressed in the passage and just think about, okay, which one of those viewpoints does the author agree with? The viewpoint that the author agrees with is going to be the main point of that passage. If the author doesn't agree with any of the viewpoints, the author just kind of stays out of that debate, doesn't state what the main point, doesn't state what their agreement is, keeps a pretty neutral tone, then the main point is simply going to be a summary of all of those viewpoints. Now, this technique works for some, doesn't work for everyone. We all read and process information differently. So another way we can find the main point is to ask ourselves, what was the question that this passage is attempting to answer? Basically, every question can be thought of as, every passage can be thought of a question and an answer. The question is like, okay, what is can be thought of as like, what is the purpose of this passage? Why was it written? What is it attempting to answer? The answer to that question that the author either provides themselves or agrees with will be the main point. So if the question is, how do homing pigeons find their way home? And the answer the author agrees with is they use sense. They have a really keen sense of smell, and they use the smells as those smells are borne out on the winds to find their way home. The main point of that passage is that homing pigeons use smells to find their way home, because that is the answer to the question that the author agrees with. If, on the other hand, the question of the passage is, how do homing pigeons find their way home? And the passage is like, well, there's like 2 answers. One is that they kind of have like a GPS in their heads that they use to find their way home. And the other is that they use smells, but we don't really know which one they actually use. Experiments don't show conclusively which one they use. In that case, if the author doesn't provide or agree with an answer, the main point is just a summary of those answers. Hey, there's 2 theories about how the homing pigeon finds its way home, but it hasn't been shown conclusively how they actually do it. Something like that. This is a real passage, believe it or not. I'm not just making this up. But anyway, another way to just do this is just summarize the passage. And one way you can kind of summarize the passage, make it a little easier for yourself to summarize the passage and make sure you're not forgetting or overlooking anything important, use the topic sentences of each paragraph to help you. Okay, the topic sentence, the first sentence of paragraph 1 was this. The second sentence was this. Third sentence was this. The topic sentence of the second paragraph was this. The topic sentence of the third paragraph was this. Okay, clearly this passage is building the argument that way. So that's going to help me summarize this passage. There's a variety of techniques you want to have to find the main point, but this is a necessary component to doing well on reading comprehension. You need to have that main point clearly expressed to actually answer it. That's misconception 1. Misconception number 2. Certain topics are inherently more difficult than others. Some people think the science passages are just inherently harder than the other ones. Some people think the humanities passages are just more difficult than the other ones. Some people think that the law passages are the most difficult. Now, this isn't exactly true. And it's not exactly the best way to look at reading comprehension. Now, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. We all studied different things in college. We all kind of have our own personal interests. So it might feel like certain topics are easier for us or more difficult for us. But the truth of reading comprehension is that the topics of the passage matter far less than the structure and word choice. no matter what the topic is about, the passage is going to present an argument being made by an author. And we have to figure out two things: how that argument is structured, which part of that argument are the premises, and which part is the conclusion / main point, and how does the author feel about the topic? What that topic is, not super important. What is important is the structure and the author's opinion. And to help us see that, I have a little exercise for us. I took a real topic, a real passage, but I just blacked out this passage like it's a highly classified document and I am the CIA. I am only going to show you a few important words in this passage. And I think by just showing you these few important words that relate to the structure of this passage and the author's attitude in this passage, we're going to be able to understand what this passage is about, even though I'm only going to show you about 20 of the 450 words. All right, so let's look at this first paragraph of this passage. I've blacked out all except, I guess, 6 words. The first word is traditionally. Traditionally is a great structural word to zero in on, because traditional can kind of go one of two ways in reading comprehension. Sometimes authors like to argue that tradition is great. We shouldn't be doing things the new way. We should go back to the traditional way. That was a better way of doing things. We should return to our tradition. Tradition's great. Other times you see tradition and the author's like, we used to do it this way, but that's kind of silly and outdated now. We have a better way to do it now. Maybe we should do it the better way. So once we know that we get the traditional, we can expect that it might be contrasted with something new or modern. And then we could just use the author's attitude to determine how the author feels about the traditional thing. Does the author have a positive or a negative view about the traditional thing? So looking at the rest of this revealed parts of the passage, what do you think the author thinks about the traditional thing? Does the author think positively or negatively about this traditional thing that they mentioned? Those words: fragmentary, very scarce, focused selectively. Yeah, we all got it. Thank you all for responding. Yeah, the author for sure feels negatively about it. Whatever this traditional thing is, it's not giving us the full picture. It's fragmentary. I guess the information is scarce. It focuses kind of selectively on stuff. So if we're going to think about what this first paragraph is about, not knowing anything about the topic, we now know that there's a traditional thing with some problems associated with it. So now, if we're going to predict what the next paragraph is going to be about, the paragraph is about something new and modern. We'll expect the author to probably have a more positive opinion about the new and modern thing. So let's see if we're right. First sentence or first phrase that gets revealed is an additional means. That kind of sounds like a new thing. An additional way, not the traditional way, it's a new additional way. Do we think that the author has a positive or negative opinion about this new additional way of doing things? Yeah, thanks, AJ. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, the author seems to have a positive view. The author says it can serve to supplement or correct. That's good. The old thing was fragmentary. This new thing can supplement or correct. Awesome. We like the new thing. That seems to be what the second paragraph is about. There's an additional thing that seems better. Next paragraph. For example, that's great to notice. For example, just tells me that, hey, the author is going to just give me an example of how this additional thing is better. They just told me the additional thing was better. Now they're going to tell me an example of precisely, specifically, how this new thing is better. And that's where we can start to see a structure form. We can start to kind of see that, okay, maybe this paragraph is where the main point is. Because this paragraph is going to be the evidence. It's a B. And evidence, of course, supports the main point. So I'm thinking, okay, if this is an example, if this is evidence of how that additional thing is better. Now I'm thinking that additional thing that seems better, that sounds like the main point. We got more passage to read. The next paragraph, another example. Awesome. That is more evidence. The last paragraph, though, the author says, however, there are limits. Okay, so the author isn't totally gung-ho on this. The author wants to acknowledge some limitations on it. A little cautionary, I agree. We might say that this is a qualification or limitation or an addressing of a potential objection to this. Now, do we think that this idea that the author says, oh, there's limits for this new thing, does that mean the author totally hates the new thing? Do we think the author wants to go back to the traditional thing? No, I don't think so. And the author still likes the new thing. The author just wants to say, hey, I want to make my argument stronger by acknowledging some limits. I'm not like a crazy zealot for this new thing. I know that it's not perfect, but it's still pretty good. So just by noting these about 20 words, we were able to get the structure of this passage. So much so that I think we can now answer one of the questions. In fact, there are 5 questions to this passage. I think with this information alone, we'd be able to answer 3 of those 5 questions. For the other 2 questions, we would at least know where to look in the passage to find the answer. Now, I want to prove this to you. Now, I want you all to attempt the main point question now. Now, to do the main point question, I will have to reveal some information, kind of declassify this passage somewhat. The traditional thing that they were talking about in the first paragraph, that was using historical documents to trace changes in Ireland's landscape. Yeah, that's what this passage is about. I'm sure none of you guessed that unless you've actually read this passage before. So that's the traditional thing. The additional new thing that they were talking about in the rest of the passage is using the analysis of fossilized pollen grains to figure out how Ireland's landscape changed historically. Okay, so given that bit of information, let's try to answer this main point question. Which answer choice do you think is correct? And you can zoom in if you need to. Got a few guesses for E. Let's see some more guesses. All right, let's look at A. Analysis of fossilized pollen is a useful means of supplementing, and in some cases, correcting other sources of information regarding changes of the Irish landscape. Well, we're told there was an additional thing. I just said that additional thing was using analysis of fossilized pollen grains. If we think back to what was actually revealed in that second paragraph, what was revealed is the idea that I can supplement, or in some cases, correct anything to object to in this answer choice. Do we feel like there's anything that's for sure wrong about this answer choice based on what we know of this passage, which admittedly isn't much? I don't think so. I think this kind of reflects what they were actually talking about. There's a traditional thing, these other sources, but we have this new thing pollen grains, that seems better. Now, I will admit to you that it doesn't talk about the limits, and that's not great. But they do kind of soften this answer choice by saying in some cases. So it's not like it says in every case it's going to correct other sources, because the author did say there are limits to how much better it is. So A is pretty good, just based on a few words. Just based on a few words, A looks pretty good. Now, some of us liked B, but I'd like y'all to read B again carefully. Doesn't B seem like the traditional thing plus the new thing? Pollen evidence is what's good. Hey, we had the traditional thing, and also now there's this new thing, and both of those things together are going to be how we learn Ireland's landscape. Does that seem like what the author said in the first paragraph? Did the author have a super positive attitude about that first thing, the historical documents? We all said no. We all said the author felt very negatively about it. So it's not going to be B. Now, yeah, we were working with limited information here, only like 20 words. So if you selected B, definitely understandable. But B is far too positive based on what we know about the author's attitude. And E was another answer choice that was selected. That's going to be far too negative based on what we know about the author's attitude. We said that the author claimed that there are limits. The author doesn't say severely limited like E says. So like most of us picked, it's A. And the point is, this passage could have been about anything. By focusing on the structural and attitudinal words that gave us the structure of the passage, the traditional additional thing, the part that told us, oh, it looks like the second paragraph is where the main point is. There's this additional thing that seems better. We're able to get the main point question correct, or at least get close to it. And that's what I mean when I say the topics aren't really inherently more difficult than the others. We shouldn't approach reading comprehension with a topic-based mindset, because no matter what the topic is, there is an argument being made by an author, and we have to figure out what that author's argument is and how the author feels. Now, another part of doing well on reading comprehension, of course, is just figuring out how the author feels. And that is why we really, really need to zero in, not on the words that talk about the topic, the subject matter words, those jargony science or legal or aesthetic words we get in the law, humanities, science passages. We want to focus on words that express the author's opinion. Got a little exercise for you here called the word choice exercise. So I'd like you all to rank the following words from most positive to least positive. You can just use the numbers. You don't need to type out the entire word. By most positive, I mean, oh, when the author uses this word, they think what they're talking about is definitely true, or they totally agree with this thing. And by least positive, I mean, when the author uses this word, they think this thing that they're talking about is total trash. They don't believe it at all. They totally disagree with it. So try to take a moment and rank these words from most positive, most agreement, to least positive or least agreement. Thank you for not only providing it, Leah, but providing your polls positive on one hand, negative on the other. That's very clever. Everyone else take a moment. All right, I'll give you all 30 more seconds. We'd like to see your responses. Cool. Thank you, Agnes. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Arush. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Atasha. Thank you, AJ. All right. Looks like we're generally pretty good. Here's how I would rank these words from positive or negative. There are a few that I think you could switch and you're not going to get much of an argument for me. I think like plausible and some merit could be switched without much of an argument to me. I think spurious and doubtful could also be switched, but in general, I think this is what your ranking should look like. Definitely on top of these rankings should be the word incontrovertible. When you say something is incontrovertible, it means you are beyond doubt. It is undoubtable, undeniable. It is not open to dispute. Exactly right, AJ. Next up should probably be compelling. Compelling means that you're very persuaded by the evidence. Plausible and some merit both means like, I kind of think it's right. It seems like it could be right. Some merit can be used negatively occasionally. Like when you say like, well, your ideas about that have some merit. Sometimes it's used as kind of a shady, like you're being a little bit sarcastic or just trying to throw someone a bone. So that's why I have it ranked below plausible. Unsettled means you're like, oh, I don't think this really proves what you think it proves. Spurious actually means that you believe that the reasoning that they used is incorrect. Seems appealing, but it's not actually correct. Doubtful, of course, means you don't think it's true, and baseless means it's completely not true. So 7 is definitely going to need to be on the lowest end there. So if your rankings are very off from what these rankings are, that is a great thing to learn at this point, or presumably early in your reading comprehension studies, because these words can be the most important words in a passage. And if we learn words for reading comprehension, if we learn to expand our vocabulary for reading comprehension, we should expand our vocabulary for these words that express the author's opinion. Because like I said earlier, about 22% of all the questions that we get reflect the author's opinion or tone or attitude. So these words will be the keys in the passage to helping us understand what that author's opinion is and answer these questions correctly. And that's because the type of answer choice that we can pick, which one of the following describes the author's stance, is going to depend on what kind of words that the author uses. Words like incontrovertible or compelling will support an answer choice that says like the author steadfastly endorses this. Words like plausible and some merit will support an answer choice that's a little bit weaker than that. Tentative agreement. It's not like full-throated agreement. It's like tentative. The author's not completely convinced, but they're more on the side of being convinced than not. Words like unsettled, spurious, doubtful. That's going to be words like reasoned skepticism. Like the author's not like totally closed off from the possibility, but they're bringing up reasons why they don't think it's true. Or if you call something baseless, that's full disbelief. You don't think it's true at all, one bit. You don't want to give it one iota of credit. These words matter. And the same point as the last exercise, these words can appear in any type of passage. It can appear in a science passage, a law passage, a humanities passage, a social science passage. The jargony words we hear about those topics do not matter as much as these words do. So these are the words that we have to be really attuned to in reading comprehension to answer a quarter of those questions, about a quarter of those questions that reflect on the tone of the author or other parties. Focusing on these opiniony words, not the subject matter, gets you the correct answer on about a fourth of those questions. And that's why I think the idea that certain topics are inherently more difficult than others is a misconception. You're missing the point. You're missing the point that these words that can appear in any type of passage are the key important words. And if this exercise was a challenge for you, that's an awesome thing to learn, I think, right now. That's great to learn because that means that you really have to work on looking for those words as you do reading comprehension passages, noting these words. Maybe if you didn't know all of these words, looking up these words, adding them to your repertoire so you can get these questions correct more frequently. All right, next up, misconception number 3. And this is one I hear all of the time. If you are a slow reader, you will always have trouble finishing the section. Now, I want to kind of reject the premise of this misconception somewhat. I really don't like words like slow reader. To me, that sounds just like too negative and self-defeating. And I think the kind of words you use to describe yourself, especially when you're taking something as difficult and stressful as the LSAT matter. So you don't like referring to anyone as a slow reader. So let's kind of change it. Let's say you are instead a considerate reader or a deliberate reader or like a careful reader. So I do want to change this. If you are a careful reader, you will always have trouble finishing the section. Now, is that true? Not really. It's based on a misconception of why reading comprehension can take a long time. The time it takes to finish reading comprehension is not really based on how fast you read. Reading comprehension sections in total, so this includes the passages and also all of the questions and answer choices, they contain about 4,500 words. The average adult reading speed is 200 to 300 words per minute. So, doing a little back of the envelope math, reading the entire reading comprehension section will take you only 15 to 22 and a half minutes. Even if you're slightly below that 200 words per minute, which, you know, the reading comprehension, it's difficult, it's dense, you may be, you still have a surplus of 10 minutes beyond just reading everything in the passage. So why does reading comprehension feel like it takes so long to so many test takers? Well, unless you read at this speed, it's not because you can't read fast enough. The reason it takes so long is that because answering the questions is difficult and time consuming, and you may be employing some ineffective strategies. So the reason reading comprehension can take a long time is that you're not answering the questions efficiently. So how can we kind of change some habits so that we can eventually speed up on reading comprehension? But we shouldn't try to read faster. Read at the speed that is comfortable for you. In fact, for some of us, for me definitely, have to deliberately slow down and become a more careful reader to better approach reading comprehension. Reading slowly and focusing on the main point, structure, and author's attitude can give you enough time to answer all of those questions, especially if we free ourselves from that detail-centric approach and avoid over-researching the passage. Those are the things that are inefficient means of answering those questions. If we're looking up the answer to every single question, remember we said that's not terribly effective. It can slow us down too much. If instead we're relying on our recollection of the main point, the structure, and the author's attitude, and we're being decisive with our selections, we can get through these passages quickly. So even if you are a careful, considerate, deliberate reader, you can still finish these sections. We just have to do better at answering the questions. And doing better at answering the questions is actually having a better understanding of the passage, not attempting to read the passage more quickly. And that can be a really harmful misconception and really misapproach to reading comprehension that a lot of people can find themselves involving themselves in. If we try to read the passage too quickly, faster than we're comfortable reading, then we find ourselves having to look up the answers to a bunch of questions. That's when we can really, really take a long time. Because even though we got through that passage more quickly, now we're really grinding to a halt on those questions. All right, misconception number 4. Such a big misconception that even stumps like doctors, surgeons, apparently. Highlighting, underlining, taking notes, all that stuff isn't worth your time. As I mentioned earlier, there's highlighter, 3 colors of highlighters that you can use. There's an underliner built into the exam interface. There's also scratch paper that you have. Now, most people use the scratch paper primarily for logic games and some logical reasoning questions, but the people who do reading comprehension the best tend to take advantage of that scratch paper as well. However, something I hear all the time is like, hey, don't bother with that. It's not worth it. It's an investment of time that you don't have. But that's almost never the case. In fact, refining your approach to how you annotate the passage on your scratch paper or mark up the passage using the highlighter and underliner built into the exam interface is a way to make major progress on reading comprehension. And that's because consciously changing the way you read and doing it consistently is incredibly difficult. We have been reading for a long, long time. Trying to change how we read in the matter of a few months or even a year is really, really difficult. In some ways, it's kind of impossible. It's like trying to change the way we breathe or change the way we walk. It's really difficult. But developing new approaches to how we annotate the passage, like write down notes, or how we highlight or underline the passage, can be an effective forcing mechanism that makes positive changes to the way we read and the way we comprehend these passages. Making good notes and highlighting the right stuff can also really limit the number of times we have to look back at the passage when we're answering certain questions, or how much we need to reread the passage as we're answering certain questions. However, the same approach won't work for everyone. So when you all go into the world of learning about the LSAT from people like me, I would be skeptical of people who say, don't bother don't bother making notes, don't bother marking up the passage, it doesn't work. Like, I don't know how much experience this person has. They probably haven't worked with a lot of students that show how much changing their approach to how they annotate and mark up the passage can help them. But I would be equally skeptical of any person like me who says, oh, this is the one approach that's going to work for everyone. Trust me, I've worked with a lot of students. At first, I might have thought like, hey, I could force this approach onto everyone. It's going to work for everyone. But you kind of quickly realize, if you're doing any amount of self-reflection, that doesn't really work. We all read and process information in a slightly different way. And while there are principles to how we annotate or mark up the passage or highlight the passage that are broadly applicable to most of us, it's not going to be the case that the same approach is going to work for everyone. So with that in mind, it's really important that you develop an approach that works for you. And part of developing that approach that works for you is constantly reviewing that approach, asking yourself, hey, did this help me answer these questions? Which parts of my notes helped me answer these questions? Which parts of my notes did not help me answer these questions? What are the things I highlighted? Did those help me answer any questions? Okay, which things that I highlighted helped me answer questions? And then based on your review, over time, refine your approach. Okay, if you're noticing a certain kind of note that you're making isn't helping you a whole lot in terms of answering the questions, stop taking those notes. If you notice that there's a few things that you're taking notes on that really do help you answer questions, continue making those notes. Develop an approach based around what you already do well, the things that are leading to success, and then modify it to work on some of the things that you don't do as well. It's like, okay, if my notes are really good at providing me a summary that helps me understand the main point of the passage, awesome, keep doing that. But if the notes that you're writing aren't really helping you answer those more argument structure-based questions, then it's going to be important that you refine your approach so that you start making notes about those argument structures, start writing notes about what the role of each paragraph is. So here's just kind of some things that you can consider writing down or marking up in your passage as you work on developing your own approach. So consider writing down the role and a brief summary of each paragraph. Now, it's always better if you keep it concise, keep it brief, both for time considerations and because making a short note proves to yourself that you understand the passage. If you find yourself just rewriting a sentence from the passage, that's when you got to stop yourself. That's going to be too long. It's also, if you have to do that, you probably didn't understand that paragraph as well as you could have. So when I say write down the role of each paragraph, I'm talking about like, is this paragraph where the main point is? Is this paragraph where evidence for that main point is? Is this a paragraph where the author is like qualifying their main point, talking about implications of a belief, or is this a paragraph where the author is talking about another viewpoint? For instance, in the passage we did together, that first paragraph would be like traditional approach. Second paragraph would be like new approach or author's endorsement of new approach. The next two paragraphs, those example paragraphs, would be evidence 1, evidence 2. And the last paragraph would be limitations or qualifications or something like that. And then brief summary of each paragraph, which can help you understand the main point of the passage and also help you with some of the detail questions as well. So on the scratch paper, for that passage you just went over, I might say, okay, this paragraph 1, this is the traditional approach. Paragraph 2, this is the new approach. Author endorses. Third, evidence 1. Fourth, evidence 2, and so on. For that comparative passage, one thing you can do is write down the similarities and differences between those two passages. What can work on this is like a T-chart. On one side, you talk about the similarities. On the other, you talk about the differences. For highlighting and underlining, there's a few types of things you should highlight or you can highlight or underline because they so frequently show up in questions. Things like cause and effect relationships or examples, important studies that are really crucial to providing the main point. Distinctions drawn between two things is another thing that gets asked about in questions all the time. You also highlight or underline words that express the author's tone. You also highlight or underline structural words like since, because, for, as, therefore, thus, hence, those that get us to understand the structure of the argument. Now, these are all things I would recommend for you to play with, to experiment with, see what works for you. But like I mentioned before, you want to find the approach that works best for you. And be careful of writing too many notes, and be careful of highlighting too many things, both because although the highlighter on the at-home LSAT works a little bit better than when they were doing it on tablets, it's still not perfect. And just highlighting less tends to be a more impactful technique than highlighting too much. Like if you highlight everything, you are essentially highlighting nothing. So it's something to remember as you kind of experiment with this approach. But again, it's really important that you experiment and find your own approach to highlighting, underlining, and taking notes. It can be an incredibly useful means of getting better at reading comprehension. You just got to find the approach that works for you. All right, last misconception. It's very difficult to improve on reading comprehension, and you probably will not improve much. Now, that is wrong. It can be difficult to improve on reading comprehension. But a lot of people find it incredibly difficult to reading comprehension. A lot of people find it very difficult to improve on reading comprehension because they have all these misconceptions about what reading comprehension tests, the best way to approach that passage, the types of things they should be paying attention to in those passages, the ways they should be taking notes and all of that. They might have misconceptions about the sources of their problems. They might think like, oh, I'm not reading fast enough. That's an issue. I need to read faster. All of those things, all of those misconceptions influence how difficult it can be to improve on reading comprehension. And because these misconceptions are unfortunately so prevalent, a lot of people do experience the difficulty on improving in reading comprehension. But if you take those wrong approaches that we talked about in these misconceptions, it can be difficult. However, a lot of practice, you can and will improve as long as you, again, to recap, avoid focusing too much on the details and begin focusing on the main point. 2, start concentrating on the words that matter, the words that connote the structure of the argument and the tone that the author is taking. And 3, developing, reviewing, and refining that perfect approach to annotating and highlighting for you. These are the techniques that are going to allow you to bypass these misconceptions that make it difficult to improve on reading comprehension. But if you continue to have these misconceptions, it can be difficult to improve. But if you focus on what we talked about today, finding the main point, focusing on those important words, developing your approach to highlighting and annotating, then the idea that it can be difficult to improve on reading comprehension will be a misconception. You will make improvements. All right, that's what I have for you today. Thank you all for listening to me. I hope this clarifies both the task at hand for reading comprehension and some ways that you can kind of approach reading comprehension in a more productive way. I do definitely want to talk about LSAT Max because we got everyone another LSAT coming in short order. We got that October LSAT coming up. Today is, in fact, the last day you can sign up for that October LSAT. So if you're thinking about taking the October LSAT and you haven't yet signed up for it, you have until 11:59 Eastern time to sign up. So you got to make that decision pretty quickly. If you do make that decision and you haven't yet chosen how to study for the LSAT, definitely want to recommend LSAT Max 60. It'll give you access to our course for 60 days. So it'll take you through that October LSAT. But that LSAT Max 60 will help you get to that October LSAT and prepare a lot. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about as it pertains to reading comprehension, since that was the topic of our day. The main thing I want to talk about is the weekly office hours. More than any other prep company, we host live office hours that are free to attend for all of our students, whether you're in the 60, 180, 365, no matter which product you have, you can attend one of our daily office hours. And we make sure to have reading comprehension sections at least 1 or 2 times every single week. I mentioned how a lot of people can neglect reading comprehension. We don't believe in that here at LSAT Max. We make sure we have daily office hours with a live instructor who'll be going over reading comprehension passages, who'll be giving you their tips about reading comprehension, allowing you to practice reading comprehension and get feedback from a live instructor. And by attending these reading comprehension office hours, you'll learn from all of our amazing instructors a bunch of different ways to approach reading comprehension, their tips for how to best underline, highlight, annotate the passage, their tips for what to pay attention to help you discern that main point, their tips about what kind of words can best reveal the structure and author's attitude that we talked about today. So by attending these daily office hours that focus on reading comprehension, you can really learn a ton. And that can really help you find the best approach to reading comprehension, the one that's going to work for you. Of course, we offer that in addition to hours of video explanations on reading comprehension, on all of the other elements of the LSAT, detailed analytics to help you pinpoint which areas of reading comprehension or any other section that you need to improve on, and all 90 prep tests for you to practice reading comprehension on. We also have one-on-one tutoring if you want even more individualized support for reading comprehension or any other part of the LSAT. So definitely look into that if you want some one-on-one approach. We have a basic package of 10 hours that if you're looking to take the October test can definitely be an effective use of your time to really pinpoint how to improve on reading comp. But we have other packages that pinpoint how to improve. You'd like to work with a tutor, definitely look into that at the URL right here. And finally, you hear from our students ourselves. Got some students who testified to how much our course or our tutors helped them. And while you can kind of read over this, I'm going to now address the questions that you dropped into the Q&A section. So yeah, if you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section. Otherwise, I'll just look at the ones that have already been posted. So first one is Leah Schweller. Leah says, do you have any specific advice for comparative passages? What methodology process is recommended and how would you approach the question? For example, doing all of the questions pertaining to passage A first and reading passage B, doing the readings first and answering all the questions in order. So to answer your question, Leah, let's talk about what the comparative passage tests. Now you mentioned as one example, the way to do it is like, okay, let's focus on passage A first, then passage B, and then think about the two passages together. I think if you do it that way, it's a little bit misapproaching the section because the section isn't really about, hey, what's about passage A independently? What's true of passage B independently? Most of the questions you get actually talk about the relationship between A and B. So I think the way I would recommend for how to do the comparative passage is to read passage A, get the main point, get the structure, get the author's opinion, all those important things we were talking about. Then read passage B, get the main point, get the structure, get the author's attitude. And then after reading both A and B, then start thinking about the similarities and differences between those two passages. And the similarities can be things like, okay, they're both talking about the same topic, or they're both talking about the same idea, or they're in general agreement with each other when they're talking about this topic or idea. Or it can be something a little bit more abstract than that. It can be something like, hey, passage A is kind of talking about this like broad idea, and passage B is giving us a specific example or a specific application of that idea. But you also want to make sure to focus on differences as well. Like, what do the authors disagree on? Is there differences with how they talk about that topic? Is one discussion more broad and the other more specific? Or are they seem to be writing for different audiences? Like, do they have such different tones that it seems like one is for a general audience and the other is for like more of a scholarly academic audience? So make sure you understand the similarities, you understand the differences, and take that knowledge into those questions. And then you can just answer the questions in order. You'll be prepared to answer any of them. You'll be prepared to answer the questions about the relationship between the two passages. But since you have such a strong understanding of each passage independently from your first read through, you'll also be able to answer the questions about the specific passages. Now, that's not to say that's the only way to do these comparative passages. As I mentioned, a lot of reading comprehension is finding the approach that works for you, your reading style, your comprehension style. But that's the one I've had the most success with students. A couple of other kind of roadblocks that that some students have with comparative passage that I've noticed. A lot of students read passage B kind of almost thinking too much about passage A. And that is kind of a conceptual roadblock that prevents them from fully understanding passage B. That makes answering those questions about passage B or answer those questions about passage A and B and their relationship very difficult. So you want to get that understanding of passage A and then look at passage B without too many preconceived notions about what passage B is going to actually say. Because I've noticed there's some trouble when students do that, when they like expect passage B to say something based on what they read in passage A, and that kind of prevents them from getting a full or accurate understanding of passage B. All right, Aruj has a question. In identifying the main point of a passage, are we generally looking for the author's overall argument versus a more literal summary? That's a fantastic question. I think they're all fantastic questions, but that's really good. And I'm glad you offered this point of distinction, Aruj. So a general rule I would follow is if the author is making a point, and with that I mean the author has a point that they personally believe to be true and that they want to make, then the main point is going to be the author's argument, the author's conclusion. So if the passage is like, yes, some critics think this about whatever, but clearly those critics are idiots, they're completely wrong, here's what's actually true, then the main point is going to be that author's belief. Now, it could say those critics are wrong, but it doesn't have to. The important thing that that answer choice is going to have to include is what the author actually thinks to be true. However, if the author isn't really present in a passage, the author isn't really making a point, the author is instead kind of describing a few separate points, like some people think this, some people think this, then the main point of the passage will likely look more like a summary of the entire passage. Because we don't have an author who wants us to convince us something, it's just a few different things that the author wants to describe in kind of a neutral manner. So hopefully that distinction made sense. Let me know if you'd like me to clarify, but that's kind of the general rule I would follow when thinking about the main point. Agnes asks, is it better to take the LSAT in October and apply by November with a score of 162 to 164, or take the LSAT in November and apply in December with hopefully a 165 plus score? The median for my top school is 164. My belief is that it's always better to apply later with a better score. A score of 1 or 2 points higher can make a really big difference in just how your application is viewed, because they do view your LSAT score as the most important feature of your application. So while applying early does have an advantage in the application process, that advantage is definitely kind of erased with a better LSAT score. So I would recommend that you apply later with the better score if you think that you're definitely capable of getting that better score. Now, this next thing I'm going to say, total speculation. I haven't actually talked to admissions officials. I don't even think admissions officials know how they're going to think about this for this application cycle. So, take what I'm about to say as conjecture, as speculation, but I will say this: given the chaos in the last application cycle, where law schools just frankly didn't know how to assess the LSAT scores that they were given, they had difficulty assessing the LSAT scores that they were provided in their applications for a variety of reasons. But last year was certainly an abnormal application process for everyone, both applicants and law schools. I think given the chaos of that application cycle, law schools are likely going to take a wait and see approach. It's conjecture. Again, I don't know that to be certain, but I strongly suspect that law schools are going to be taking a wait and see approach. When law schools take a wait and see approach that apply early in the cycle, that advantage is even more minimized because they're not really deciding who they're going to let in until later on. So again, personal speculation, don't know that to be true, but that is my kind of guess based on the tea leaves that I'm seeing. So again, that's all to say. it's better to apply later with a better score, and I'll encourage you to do that. Aruj also asks, how worthwhile is it to take time to understand the examples given in support of the main point? Definitely important to know this, like a kind of the general outline of what that example is. Like, okay, it's a study. Here's what happened in that study generally. And it's even more important to know what that example illustrates. So how that example supports the main point. So for example, no pun intended, in that passage we did where I kind of blacked out a lot of the text, we had two examples there. Both examples were of a time where pollen analysis showed that what the documentary record suggested was completely wrong. So in other words, they corrected two examples of times in which the documentary record was corrected by pollen analysis. So it's definitely important that you know that those examples are examples of a time that the pollen record corrected the documentary record. Do you have to understand every last little nuance of those examples? Almost never. When they have examples, typically they ask either about just like basically what those examples said, or more frequently, what those examples illustrated. So those are the real takeaways you want to get from examples. All right. Tim has another question. Tim has a question. How can you avoid spending too much time researching the passage when there's a question that is detail-oriented and requires inferring from the passage? When you're in doubt about two similar answers, what role do the main point and author's opinion play in these questions? So yeah, I think there's a couple of questions kind of embedded in this question, Tim. The first is, how do you avoid spending too much time researching the passage? One is just kind of, if you have that really strong reading of the passage and a really strong understanding of the main point and structure and author's attitude, what you can do with the author, what you can do with many answer choices on even detail-oriented questions is just eliminate anything that seems unfamiliar or seems like it slightly conflicts with the author's attitude or the main point of the passage. So that can hopefully reduce the amount of times you have to look back at the passage to confirm that an answer choice is wrong or right, if you're able to do that more consistently. And when you are in doubt about two similar answer choices, what you can do, and what I've found the most success helping students do, is instead of thinking about, okay, which of these two answer choices is correct, switch your thought process to, okay, which of these two answer choices is wrong? And start looking for problems with those answer choices. And that's when you can use the main point and author's opinion. You can say, okay, these two answer choices look both kind of right. If I'm looking at them a little bit carefully, looking for problems, I can kind of see that this answer choice is a little bit different than what the author is talking about in their main point, or seems to slightly conflict with the author's opinion. So that's how you can use the main point and author's opinion when you are in doubt, looking between two similar answer choices. Now, I don't want to say that you can do this for all detail-oriented questions. There will be some detail-oriented questions where you do need to look back at the passage. And sometimes there is just a kind of singular line that helps show that this was in the passage. That's especially true on questions that ask for, like, according to the passage, blah, 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 or the passage states which one of the following. For those, there usually is a line in the passage that you can look up and find the right answer to. So in that case, it's totally okay. In some cases, advisable to look back at the passage. You can use your notes to help direct you to the part of the passage that's likely to contain that line that tells you the correct answer is correct. Or you can even sometimes use Control F. If you're not aware, the current version of the LSAT, you're taking it on a laptop, allows you to use Control or Command F to do a search and find. Definitely wouldn't over rely on that, because it's only as effective as the word you choose to look up. If you're looking up for a word in the answer choice that's not used in the passage, Well, it either means that answer choice is wrong or that answer choice is just using a synonym of that word, but not that word itself. So it's not a totally effective tool, but it can be effective for those some of those cases in which you have to look back at the passage. Richard has another question. Richard has, I don't know. Anyway, Richard has a question. Can scanning questions first prior to reading the passage assist in finding correct responses and saving time? I mentioned kind of briefly that I'm personally very skeptical of kind of gimmick solutions like that. And the fact is that most questions on reading comprehension do not give you a strong sense of where to pay attention to in the passage. That's again because so many of the questions reflect on the main point of the entire passage or the author's attitude as expressed in the entire passage or the structure of that passage. So skimming the questions first does not really give you an advantage on reading the passage. Now, in fact, usually that'll lead to just wasting time. When you get really, really good at reading comprehension and you've done a ton of passages and you really have a strong sense of what they like to ask in reading comprehension passages, a lot of times you can just kind of predict the kind of questions that they're going to ask. Like, oh, I see this detail here. I think they're going to ask this type of question about it. So that's like, ideally the kind of reading comprehension status you can get to. That said, I hope one theme we've all gotten out of this, Richard, is like not one solution works for everyone. So I want to say definitely don't read the questions first because everyone finds a technique that works for them. But personally, in my experience, never seen that been used effectively of reading the questions first. But, if you need to, maybe try it, but haven't seen it help much. Rich has a question, how can you determine the author's intended audience? Usually the thing to pay attention to is the author's tone and word choice. The author's tone, the author seems to be really excited or really enthusiastic or super duper critical. Tends to be the case that it's more for a more general audience. And more like academic papers, more professional papers, the tone is going to be a lot more muted, right? Like you can kind of imagine, if you've read scientific papers or papers from peer-reviewed papers, stuff like that. It's not the case that the authors are really excitable or enthusiastic and use exclamation points and stuff like that. Definitely more of a muted kind of scholarly tone. Another thing to look for is word choice. The word choice will be more complex and difficult, and we'll see more jargon, especially jargon that's not defined in more scholarly papers. So if the author is using really difficult words, really jargony words, and the author doesn't even define what those words are, then it's likely the case that the author is writing to an audience that already is expected to know those words, i.e. a very scholarly academic audience. So those are some of the kind of clues you can look for. There's other stuff with sentence structure that we could really talk for a long time about that. But those would be the two things I would look for, usually to be the most reliable clues. All right, looks like those are all the questions we got. So again, thank you for hanging out today with this webinar, learning about reading comprehension. I want to wish you all the best of luck as you prepare for reading comprehension. And hopefully the lessons you've learned today will help you avoid some of the roadblocks that affect far too many test takers. So best of luck with that. Have a good time studying and hope to see you again in one of our office hours. All right, bye everyone.